Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second in our three-part learning series, Happy, Healthy Children in Shelter and in Supportive Housing. My name is Cindy Manginelli, and I'm going to be leading our session today. I'm going to change my view here so that I can see everyone a little better. As I said, my name is Cindy, and I'm with the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council. And so the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council, we're a national organization, and we do all kinds of things like research, education, training, technical assistance, policy work, all kinds of things like that at the intersection of healthcare and homelessness. I encourage you to visit our website, nhchc.org, and learn more about what we do. You will see a ton of resources there that can be helpful both in the healthcare setting, but also specifically to those working in shelter. The training that we're doing today has been sponsored by the Bureau of TennCare. And so we have a really unique grant with Tennessee's version of Medicaid called TennCare, which allows us to do trainings like this for family shelters and those who serve children experiencing homelessness in the state of Tennessee. We opened this up specifically we initially invited just family shelters in the state of Tennessee to attend this training. We did open it up a little bit to include some family shelters in other states, but we really wanted this to be sort of a small group so that rather than just a webinar, this would be more like a learning session. And so there are going to be times when I ask you questions. I would love for you to respond. I'm really hoping this is the time when we can learn from each other. I will definitely be doing most of the talking, but I would love to hear as we talk about resiliency today, what has worked for you? As you hear what I'm talking about, what does it remind you of? What do you find problematic? What's worked, what hasn't, best practices around this really important topic of resiliency. So feel free to use the chat. As Brandon said, I would love people to go ahead and introduce themselves in the chat. I will try to monitor the chat, but Brandon, please do let me know if anyone says anything or has a question. You can also use on your Zoom control panel there, if you click the more button, you'll see a place for reactions where you should be able to raise your hand. So again, I encourage you to take yourself off mute. Please do respond, especially as there'll be times when we ask questions, and I would love to hear what's worked for you. How can we kind of learn from each other around this? Last month, we did a session on children and trauma, and we talked about how homelessness specifically can be a real source of traumatic stress and how that especially looks in children and in youth. We talked about adverse child experiences. We talked about how all of that works together and the signs and symptoms of traumatic stress in children. Today, we're going to take the next step in that process, in that idea of trauma-informed care. I believe in trauma-informed care. I believe it's very important. I do trainings on trauma-informed care. I've done a lot of research around that. And I think it is a key component in the services that we offer to those who have experienced crisis, to families in crisis. I do think, though, that as we talk about trauma-informed care, there can be a tendency, if we're not careful, if that's our primary focus is trauma-informed care, we can become a little warped in the way we respond to people. And we can respond to people in such a way that we begin to talk to them as if, because of the bad things that have happened to you, you're broken, you're damaged, you're weaker. For the rest of your life, people will need to talk to you differently. You have special needs now because of the trauma you've experienced. We can actually train people to think that way. We can actually train people to have a victim mentality if we're not careful. If trauma-informed care is very focused and becomes our primary focus. What we're going to talk about today, I think, is a vital next step in the trauma-informed care conversation, and that is resiliency. The ability to bounce back. What does that look like in the families that we're serving? How can we encourage that? That's what we're going to talk about today. So for me, this is really the hopeful next step. I love this idea of resiliency. I get really excited about it. I've done a lot of research around it, and in my background is primarily in direct services. I worked in a church for several years with children and families in crisis. I worked in a domestic violence shelter as a children's counselor for several years, in a clinic for refugees and immigrants, and then in a program for women coming out of incarceration, women without insurance needing detox services and treatment services. So this idea of resiliency has been a big part of my life and sort of my life purpose. And so it excites me to know that we can be sources of hope for other people, that we can inspire other people, that we can engage people who are in crisis, who are in the worst possible time of their life. And we can be sources of hope and encouragement, and that the hope and goodness that we bring to people's lives can actually change outcomes, can actually have long lasting effects. I believe that, or I wouldn't do this kind of work. And so I hope that this conversation reminds you of your potential to do that, and also gives you some real concrete tools of how can we encourage people to be resilient and to bounce back. This is kind of how we're going to do that today. We're going to we're going to do a little bit of review from last month and homelessness and trauma in children. We're going to talk about what determines resiliency. We're going to talk about barriers to resiliency. How do we encourage resiliency as a program, as an individuals? And then what are some really kind of challenging questions that we have to ask ourselves as we think about resiliency? I had a breakfast meeting this morning, and as I got out of the car, I was running behind, and my cell phone had been in my lap. And when I got out of the car, my cell phone flew out of the car. It hit the curb where I had parked, bounced into the gravel 2 or 3 times, and landed face down. So I got out of the car and I, reached down for it. And of course, my thought was, what am I going to find when I pick it up? Is it going to be shattered? Am I going to spend 2 hours and $200 this afternoon getting my cell phone fixed? Is it just going to have a big crack that I just live with for the next, 6 months or whatever? Or is it going to be fine? And I picked it up and it was fine, which is awesome. Sometimes when we engage a family in crisis, we can kind of have that feeling. How has this crisis impacted this family? What are we going to find? And what are going to be the long-term effects, right? The families, the phone's flown out of the car, the family's in crisis. It has left the place of safety and security, and it has just crashed. It's bounced and gone from crisis to crisis. And now the crisis is multi-layered. And when you're working with a family that's homeless, it has become complex in most situations. And it's very difficult to know, if you're like me and you read the intake paperwork or you go through the call notes and you have that first session with the family, you can really wonder, what am I going to find here? And what is the impact this is going to have? I can spend a lot of time thinking about what routines and rituals can I establish so that my cell phone doesn't fall out of the car, so that I don't drop it, right? Put it in my pocket, put it in my purse. And then I can also focus on how can I protect my cell phone so that even if I drop it, nothing happens to it. It doesn't break. When I worked in shelter and my children were little, my phone was in this otter box, and it had like 3 layers, and it was sealed up, and I actually had to use a little screwdriver to get it out. And when I wanted to make a call, I had to push the buttons really hard because I really wanted to keep it safe, because it was having a hard life going everywhere with me. And so as a community, as an agency, as an individual, there are the different approaches that we can take to help families and children be resilient. One is that sort of proactive, upstream approach. How can we engage families as a community so that they never hit that crisis, so that mom and dad don't separate, so that no one's incarcerated in the family, so that no one's institutionalized, so that no one's neglected, no one's abused? Certainly a lot of what we do as a community, both spoken and unspoken, intentionally and unintentionally, is to keep those adverse childhood experiences from happening in the first place. But by the time you and I engage families, we're past that point. The adverse childhood experiences have happened. And so what can we do to provide that otter box? What can we do to help that child, that family, put those supports, those protections in place, so that as they survive this crisis, as they go through the crashes and the bumps and all the things that are going to have to happen before they're stable again, or maybe they're not going to be really truly stable again for a long time, what tools can we give them? What supportive services can we give them so that they bounce back and they're not shattered, they're not overcome by their circumstances? That's really what we're talking about when we talk about resiliency, is how do we How do we develop that support around them? What are the most efficient, most effective, most evidence-based practices that kind of build that shell around them? Now, the reality is resiliency, you're going to see at the end of the presentation that I've got sources that I've quoted. You can go online and you can read a lot of information about resiliency. But the reality is, just like we talked about, trauma is very often in the eye of the beholder. Resiliency is very much the same way. And unfortunately, you will not leave here today with a formula that is guaranteed to produce resilient children. That would be awesome if we did. You'll find that theme consistent throughout all the literature that you engage on resiliency. There are things that there are personal strengths that contribute to resiliency. There are protective factors that contribute to resiliency. We're going to talk about all of that. But there is if you follow this checklist, your children, the children you serve, will be resilient. They will overcome. They will not be overwhelmed. There's also, just like there's no formula for trauma. I have 5 children. And several years ago, their dad and I got divorced. Those 5 children, they're very close in age. They were all growing up with the same support system, with the same protective factors. They had many of the same personal strengths as siblings. Some of that varied. They were growing up, everything was the same. The way they process that traumatic event is very different. Some of them were much more resilient than others. They remember it differently. They processed it differently. They're still, as adults now, they're still processing it differently. Even though they had the same protective factors, they had the same environment, same genetic makeup, so much was the same. The way they processed it was different. And you're going to find that to be true with families that you serve as well. And so these are going to be tools, principles, things like that we're going to talk about today. Unfortunately, not a guarantee. So a little bit of review. We talked about ACEs last time, adverse childhood experiences. Remember, we talked about there was a study done that looked at what are things that children experience, that people experience in their childhood that leads to negative outcomes in adulthood. So it was determined that the higher your ACE score, the more likely you are to have negative outcomes as a result as a child. So the way this works is you look at these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 factors, and you give yourself a point for each one that you experienced under the age of 18. Each one that you experienced as a child. And that is your ACE score, somewhere between 0 and 10. And then those with an ACE score above 4 are more likely to experience things like hypertension, diabetes, depression, substance use, suicidality. Those with a score over 6 are even more likely. That's what we're talking about when we talk about ACEs. And so when we think about those who are children experiencing crisis, family crisis, homelessness specifically, we would expect to see a fairly high ACE score. We know that not all, but many of them experience a number of these different elements in their family. And that does lead to more negative outcomes in adulthood. We looked at this last week as well. We talked about, these are some of the specifics around that. So you can see up in the top right corner, specifics around disease, around mental health issues. You see here statistics about what that looks like across the population. So a lot of research done on what we already know, and that is that those who experience a lot of trauma and a lot of traumatic stress in their childhood are more likely to have negative outcomes. When we talk about resiliency, we're talking about the good news today. We're talking about how do we overcome, how do we provide support that hopefully prevents a lot of these negative outcomes. We talked about how childhood trauma in and of itself, there are risk factors that make traumatic stress more likely and that make it more likely that a child will suffer something and as a result, experience significant traumatic stress. Again, not formulaic. Some children have just unbelievable things happen and they don't seem to have any effects, short-term or long-term. Others have things happen that we think, man, in a third world country, that would just really be a minor inconvenience, but they really suffer long-term effects. And there are different factors that contribute to that. I want to say too, the very nature of this discussion today, we are going to be talking about bad things that happen. We're going to be talking about sources of trauma. And so I'm going to be sharing stories that talk about bad things that happen. You'll see I'm going to talk about them fairly unemotionally. We're going to talk about them fairly academically. We're really just looking at a case study kind of thing and moving on. I'm doing that intentionally because I don't want this to be an emotionally heavy conversation. I'm really hoping that no one feels like they're kind of drowning in this or gets overwhelmed. But the reality is we are going to be talking about some pretty difficult things. I just want to give you a heads up on that. So the severity of the event, the proximity to the event, the caregiver's reactions, the prior history of trauma, family and community factors, all of these contribute to how a child responds to trauma. We talked a lot about that last month. So I'm not going to spend as much time on that today. Happy to get that recording to you. But just to know that there are a lot of different factors in a traumatic event that determine how that child is going to process that and whether or not they'll process it as trauma, and it will feel like a traumatic event to them. Again, if we're not careful, we can teach a child that something traumatic has happened to them. And so we have to be careful about that we don't assume because bad things have happened or because this bad thing happened, you're now not okay. You're now traumatized. On the other hand, we don't want to assume, hey, you really haven't had it that bad. You're probably fine. So all of this trauma and resiliency can be very subjective. So taking all of that into consideration, all of the traumatic events that we talked about last month that we just reviewed, taking all of that into consideration, we're working with children who are in crisis, children who have had difficult things happen. What does it look like to encourage resiliency? When we talk about resiliency, what we're talking about, the root definition there of the root word in resiliency is to bounce back, to recover, to face negative circumstances and yet experience a positive outcome. What's really hopeful to me as we think about resiliency with children in crisis is that you don't become, by nature of the definition, you become resilient by facing negative circumstances. If there are no negative circumstances, you don't develop resiliency. And so that means that this can be really positive. I'm not going to give a Pollyanna, I'm not going to be unrealistic or naive here, okay? I realize a lot of people face negative circumstances and they don't experience a positive outcome. We're going to talk about that getting out of whack. But it's a really good thing to know that the only way to become resilient is to face negative circumstances. And so there's an opportunity here. So when we think about resiliency and bouncing back, we're thinking about how do we become stronger? How do we face this? How do we develop courage? How do we find hope? But we face a negative circumstance, but we experience a positive outcome. And as we said, it's not a recipe. It's not one size fits all by any means. So when we think about resiliency, what we're really thinking about is balancing or making sure that the negative does not overwhelm the positive. We're balancing resources here. We're balancing our resources and our experiences. So ideally with all of us, as negative things happen to us, as bad things happen to us, ideally we have enough coping mechanisms, enough support, enough protective factors, enough personal strengths that those positive factors are never overcome by the negative things that happen to us, that we maintain a balance. And so that's what, the very basis of resiliency, that's what we're talking about, is we want to make sure that the negative things that are happening, the risk factors that this individual is facing, the trauma that they're facing, is balanced by protective factors and personal strengths. And so in families where, wow, there are a lot of risk factors, there's a lot of trauma, then we've really got to think about how do we build their protective factors and how do we build their personal strengths so that they're not overwhelmed. That's when traumatic stress becomes a problem, is when I am overwhelmed by the bad things happening to me and I cannot cope. I'm drowning in it, right? And so that's what we want to think about, is how do we maintain that balance, or even ideally that the positive is way more than the negative. So I'm going to talk, this is primarily, I think, going to be a really positive conversation as we think about resiliency. But I want to start off by thinking about what are the barriers to resiliency. What are attitudes, mindsets, perspectives, core beliefs that make resiliency difficult? So we're going to talk about most of these from the positive side, but I do want to hit some of these. And as we walk through these, I'd like you to think about, how do homelessness and adverse childhood experiences contribute to these mindsets? And that's what I'm going to ask you to kind of weigh in on as I finish this list, that I'd really like to get your opinion on, is how does homelessness and the kind of crisis that the children you serve are facing, how does that make it likely that they may feel these ways, that they may really feel like they may really have some of these mindsets? So vulnerability. Vulnerability is a barrier to resilience. If I believe in my heart, I'm not safe. I'm not safe. At any moment, I could be taken. I could be abandoned. I will not have what I need. What I need will not be given to me. That is a barrier to resiliency. And if a child believes that deep in their core, that's a foundational belief for them, it will be very hard for them to develop resiliency. So you may have a child who was in an abusive situation. They were being neglected, they were being physically abused, they were being sexually abused, just a terrible situation. And they come out of that terrible situation and they're placed in a loving family for whatever reason. If they still in their heart believe, I am not safe, at any moment, this could all fall apart. I will not be given what I need. And of course, they wouldn't verbalize it that way. But if they still believe that, even though they're in a new environment, a safe environment, a loving environment, that deep sense of vulnerability can keep them from developing the belief systems that they will need in order to be resilient, in order to progress, in order to move past the trauma. A sense of powerlessness. No matter what I say, no matter what I do, nothing's going to change. I have no ability to influence the world around me. I have no voice. I have no impact. Nothing changes because of me. My opinion doesn't matter. That is a barrier to resiliency. The inability to attach or connect. We could talk for hours about attachment and how that the security or insecurity that provides in a child, and as they age, how attachment issues can lead to mental illness and then relationship issues, the inability to trust. But if I cannot trust another person, I cannot rely upon another person, even if they're reliable, that is a barrier to resiliency. We're going to talk more about that. A victim mentality. I had a couple of years ago, I attended a talk given by Sue Klebold, which was just phenomenal. She has a TED Talk. I think she has a book. If you have the opportunity to see anything she's done, I would encourage you to look at it. I've not looked at all that, but if it's anything like her talk, it would be very good. Sue Klebold is the mother of one of the young men who perpetrated the Columbine shootings and then who took his own life. And in this talk, she said that she had done a lot of research around school shootings, obviously because Columbine and her situation in a lot of ways set something in motion that became really problematic with school shootings. It modeled something for a certain kind of student that became really scary. It's become really scary in our country's history. And so she wanted to know, what are the common denominators? Because as she looked at school shooters as children who perpetrate mass shootings in a school, she saw they were all over the place. They came from different economic backgrounds. They had different academic backgrounds. They had different races. They were in different parts of the country. They watched different television shows or played different video games. She could not find what is the common denominator. What is the big red flag, right? And the only common denominator that she found in all of the students that she had researched up until that point who had participated in school shootings was they all had a victim mentality. They all had this mindset, I never win. Everything's against me. Everyone gets something that I don't. Everyone thinks they're better than me. Everyone is better than me. No matter what happens, this system's pushing me down. No matter what happens, I have no voice. I have no agency. that mentality was the common thread. Victim mentality can be very, very dangerous. Something that if we're not careful, we can feed into. And then egocentricity. Children are naturally egocentric. They think everything revolves around them, right? They think they're the center of the universe. That's a characteristic of childhood. So I participated in a research study when I was a children's counselor at a DV shelter. And one of the things we had to do was to try to find a way to measure how egocentricity affected a child's view of domestic violence and family crisis. So I had these little Playmobil guys, and we had a little Playmobil house and a little Playmobil city. It was very cool. So every child, I think from the age of 3 to 15, as part of their intake, and somewhere in the first week or so that I would meet with them, I would set up the little Playmobil village, and we'd have the house, and we'd have mom and dad and grandma and grandpa and brother and sister and the dogs and the neighbors and the mailman. I set it all up. And we'd be playing, and I'd say, mommy and daddy are fighting. So I'd have the family all set up there. Mommy and daddy are fighting. Mommy and daddy are very angry at each other. Whose fault is it? Point to the person who's making mommy and daddy fight. And I believe it was 92% of the time, they would take their little finger and they would point right to the Playmobil child that looked the most like them. Every child in the family, as I did it individually, would point to the child that was closest to their age. When I would say something like, mommy and daddy are fighting, whose job is it to stop the fighting? Who should make the fighting stop? They would take their little finger and they would point right to the child that looked the most like them. So most of the children that you're engaging in a lot of ways, they believe on some level, the reason we're homeless, the reason we're here, the reason we can't see daddy, the reason mommy's in prison, somehow flows from them. That they're the cause and that they're the solution. I did it. I need to fix it. Some children will feel that profoundly based on their personality type, sometimes based on their birth order, based on what their parents have told them. Some children will profoundly feel that to be true. Some children won't feel it as much. That idea that this is my fault, I've got to fix this, that's a barrier to resiliency. Blame, shame, guilt, those are barriers to resiliency. And so, so that's what we're going to talk about now, in the positive aspect of how do we combat that. So there's no shame in that as parents, right? I've made mistakes. I don't want my children to feel like it's their fault. We got to shake that off, right? We've got to think about now, how do we move forward with that, especially when we think about the children that we serve. So I would really love to hear, as you hear this list, how do you feel like, when you think about the children you serve, the families you serve, how can homelessness or poverty, crisis, cause a child to feel these ways? Or do you feel that the children that you serve are more likely to feel this way because of their situation, because of their homelessness? What are your thoughts as you hear that? Does anyone find that to be true? That you find that, do you find this list of characteristics to be more true in the children that you serve? So even just in the chat, a yes or a no would be helpful. Do you find that the children that you serve tend to feel vulnerable? Or is that not really something that you're seeing?
Hi, my name is Miranda Howard. I work with RAP as a domestic violence agency. I work as one of our residential specialists, so in our safe home. And I think definitely like the powerlessness and the vulnerability are huge with the children that come into our safe home, because this is such drastic change and they don't know like if things are going to change again. So they kind of have to go with it. They're changing schools, they're probably changing friends, and then a couple of weeks they might have to do that all over again. So just being vulnerable and not really having power or choice in what they do either, because it is at the end of the day kind of the parent that is deciding which is for the safety of her and her kids most of the time. So that's a good thing, but they don't really have choices in the way that maybe they should.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There is a unique sense of powerlessness in being a homeless child. Very often coming to shelter, not knowing why they're there, where are they? There's no context for shelter, right? You don't read any children's books where the kid comes to shelter unless you purchase one specifically because you're in shelter. So yeah, and like you said, they will change again. You're not going to be in shelter forever. So you've made this drastic change, and it's temporary too. We're going to talk a lot about that and how do we develop resiliency around that. But yeah, there is so much powerlessness in the life of a child who's homeless, so much inconsistency. What can you really count on when you're going from shelter to shelter, from family to family? What's consistent? Even just the clothes you're wearing, the toys you get to take, all of that. There is a real sense of powerlessness. I think you're absolutely right. All right, so let's talk about two different components of resiliency. One is personal strengths and one is protective factors. So personal strengths, we're going to think about elements of who I am, my personality, my being. Protective factors, we're going to think of what exists around me. And these two things work together to create resilience. So it's interesting. This is an interesting list. I didn't make these up. This list, most of this came from an article that you'll see at the end that's looking at international homelessness. So all kinds of children and youth who experience homelessness. What are the common denominators, the personal characteristics that we see that help them to be more resilient? But again, as you look at a variety of resources, you will find a lot of these pop up. There's strong consistency in the literature around the personal strengths that you'll often see common characteristics of children who are resilient. It's difficult to measure resiliency. A lot of these studies, when they're measuring, okay, is the child resilient? It's really hard to determine. You may have a child who really appears to be resilient when they're 5, that when they're 15, they don't appear to be resilient at all. And when they're 25, they appear to be doing better. When they're 40, so it's really difficult to measure resilience. The primary way that resilience is typically measured in children and youth is by their academic performance. And so that's not really fair. There are a lot of reasons why someone may or may not have a strong academic performance. Sometimes we even use developmental, their development, their emotional development, their physical development as indicators of resilience. It's hard to measure, but we're going to go forward with this list and as the commonly agreed upon list, and even though we know that's hard to measure. So personal strengths, a sense of humor, the ability to to genuinely laugh at my circumstances. Another phrase that you'll see a lot in literature is a laid back personality. I don't overthink it. I don't have to figure it all out. I don't think about who's at fault. I just kind of go with the flow. That kind of personality lends itself more to resilience. Whereas those who tend to be perfectionistic or think through details or need lots of information may have a harder time being resilient. So a sense of humor, a sense of self. I know who I am. I know I have a favorite color. I have a favorite book. I have a favorite movie. I know what kind of music I like. I have an identity, right? I have a really strong sense of me and that I am unique and separate from what's happening to me. Perceived control. Control is a big part of resilience. I have the ability, as we said earlier, to impact the world around me. My decisions make an influence. My decisions make an impact. So the more choices I can make choices, and those choices are honored, they're respected. A strong sense of control leads to resilience. Assertiveness. Sometimes an assertive child, we think can be a really negative quality. If we think a child is stubborn, they have to get their way. They won't yield. When it comes to resilience, assertiveness is really significant. I don't just go, well, whatever everyone wants. A lot of times in children who have experienced abuse, we see a lack of personal boundaries because their boundaries have been violated so often. So they're unable to set a boundary. Physically, with my body, emotionally, I may not have any sense of personal space. I may not recognize your personal space, but I may also not have any sense of creating my own personal space. And so assertiveness, here I am, this is where I start and you stop, setting boundaries. while that can be at times feel, difficult in a small child or even in an older child, we may not like that. It's actually a personal strength that can be really valuable in coping. Motivation. I know why I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm going to keep doing this because I've got a goal, the ability to set goals and to keep those goals and to believe that goals are keepable. If I have a goal, I'll be able to attain it. My life is such that I have enough control over my life to set a goal and keep it. And, as was pointed out, that very often is difficult with homeless children. A sense of independence, problem solving skills, that again, where I set out to solve a problem and I am able to solve it. I have agency. Self-regulation, we're going to talk more about that in a few minutes, but I'm able, when I think about my mood, so I get angry, I get happy, I get sad, I get disappointed. None of those overwhelm me. I'm able to get mad and then calm down. I'm able to get mad but not lose all control. I'm able to be sad, but I'm able to stop crying too. My emotions don't overwhelm me and everyone around me. I'm able to self-regulate. And then optimism about the future. I like this one because this is something that's a really easy one for us to encourage, to picture a hopeful future for those that we're serving. So many children I've worked with, just no sense of future. What do you want to be when you grow up? I don't know. I'm going to grow up and I'm going to have a lot of children so that we can have more food, so that we can get, more food stamps. Oh, I've heard that so many times. And, but there's no optimism, there's no hope. So the ability to picture a hopeful, promising future, it's a big part of resiliency. I'm bouncing back because I believe there's something ahead. There's something to bounce forward to. It's a big part of resiliency. So those are personal strengths. It is easier as helpers to think about building up protective factors than it is personal strengths. But we're going to talk about how we can do that. But it is difficult to teach a child to have a sense of humor. Some of these things we model, and that's the best way that we can encourage them. But some of these things make up the child's personality. And there's so many things that can go into that. But a lot of these things, we just need to keep in mind, we're always modeling. If I have the ability to laugh at myself, if I have the ability to laugh at silly things that happen to me, it's sad things that happen to me, but I can have a sense of humor about it. All of that can enable me to model something. But personal strengths are a little bit harder than protective factors. So protective factors, positive relationships with caring adults. And you will see this at the top of the list in all of the research that you do in resilience. This is where we go back to attachment. We're going to talk about more in a few minutes. Positive relationships with caring adults. Those positive relationships, there are people who believe in me. There are people who are here for me. Those positive relationships can carry a child through a lot of really negative circumstances. The love, the care, the attention from adults can be that factor that just makes all the difference. Effective parenting. So ideally, that's coming from their parents. That's coming from their primary caregivers. Positive friends. Peers, who are the peers they have around them? And do those peers provide support and encouragement? Do those peers feed the kind of personal strengths that we talked about before? Feelings of, are there friends that I can laugh with? And this is again something, and so I'd like you to think about, how does homelessness impact that? How does homelessness impact positive relationships with caring adults? How does it affect parenting? If you're in a shelter, how does that affect your ability to parent? How does it affect your ability to spend time with friends? Faith and spirituality is another one. Even religious tradition, religious ritual, these are things that you'll see on a lot of the lists, almost across the board. I have a belief, some of this is that positive relationship. I have a belief in a God, or whatever word you use. I have a belief in a positive, in a sustaining power, in a power that loves me, that cares for me. Again, whatever language you use around that. Even religious ritual can provide this consistency. No matter where we were in shelter, we always went to church, right? So if that's the case, that provides a structure, that provides a routine, that provides predictability. And so a faith culture, a strong spirituality can provide a real sense of purpose. I know why I'm here in the world. I know what I'm supposed to be doing. There are a lot of possibilities. I have the ability to make impact. All of that can be fed by faith, spirituality, and a religious culture. Cultural values, children who have a strong sense of culture. So the culture that I grew up in, that can be fed by my race, by my ethnicity, by a strong sense of family tradition, that can be fed by my religion. But this idea of I belong to a culture, and we are a people who have something in common, and we are a people who believe in these things, and we are a people who do these things. That culture can provide a sense of ritual and identity and purpose and motivation. And so all of those things can be protective factors. Effective teachers, academic influences, again, those can be those positive relationships with caring adults. A lot of children will identify specific teachers, coaches, school counselors who provided those caring relationships when their families could not, provided that stability, that ritual, that predictability. And then connection. All of these can be kind of summed up with connection and attachment. I feel connected to something. That's that sense of literally, we get this idea of support, right? That when I start to fall, when I'm overwhelmed by the negative, something's holding me up. It's the connections to people, to rituals, to beliefs, to God, to power, all those things together help me to feel connected to something. And those connections provide a support so that when I start to fall, I don't fall all the way. It's true for adults. It's also very true for children. So how does homelessness affect a child's ability or affect these protective factors in their relationships? Or does it? Some of this we hit on before. Some of this we talked about before with the inconsistency. If you're changing schools, if you're transient, if your family's transient by nature, and so you lack the ability to feel rooted in a community. So you don't, certainly when we talk about children in shelter or children who've been moved into permanent supportive housing, those neighborhood kids, their proximity to family members and those that they are used to hanging out with and playing with, all of that changes. And sometimes they never reconnect. And so if a child is constantly moving, then certainly that can have an effect on that as well, right? Sometimes this is summarized with the acronym ARC, with the idea of an ARC framework: attachment, regulation, and competency. So in some ways, maybe we could sum all of this up in attachment, regulation, and competency. So attachment being the capacity to form and maintain a healthy emotional bond with another person who is a source of comfort, safety, and caring. The capacity to form and maintain a healthy emotional bond. Attachment's huge, and we could talk about attachment for hours. We won't, but attachment for a child is really that foundation of I belong, I'm secure, I'm safe, my needs will be met. I am valued, I have value, I am loved. All of these things come in with the idea of attachment. So sometimes in early childhood, the idea is that if something threatens that belief, if something seems to contradict that belief, so a child learns very often, maybe even in infancy, when I cry, no one comes. When I cry, I feel pain. I'm ignored. When I'm hungry, no one comes. Or I'm responded to with anger, or I experience pain because I'm being abused, or I'm being ignored, or whatever. And I don't mean to minimize any of that. That can affect a child's ability to attach to their primary caregiver. And so there's a lot of thought that attachment begins with those very early relationships, their primary caregivers, even in infancy, attachment can be affected by a lot of different things, but that ability to form and maintain a healthy emotional bond as a child, as a young child, and to find that bond to be consistent. So there are people in my life that no matter what I do, they still come when I cry. No matter what I do, no matter how angry I get, no matter how sad I get, no matter how much something hurts, there are people who come in and they rescue me, and they take care of me, and they love me. And that provides a way by which I become secure, and I become validated, and I become affirmed. So a lot of this idea of resiliency comes down to attachment. And we do see in a lot of children experiencing homelessness, this inability to attach. And this can be displayed in a couple of different extremes. So I've had children where we're all in the playroom, and I've got 10 or 11 kids in the playroom, and mom brings in, new mom comes in, and she brings in a 3-year-old, and she's holding the 3-year-old in her arms, and the 3-year-old clings to her and won't let her go, even though, and just, that severe separation anxiety. That can be in an exaggerated way. Some of that's normal. Some of that can be attachment. There are also times when a new mom will come in with a 3-year-old who's never seen me before, and the 3-year-old would throw herself into my arms and hold on to me and never want to let go, when she really should have been more attached to her primary caregiver. She felt no attachment to her primary caregiver and was very willing to in every way attach to a complete stranger for whatever reason. And so there's a lot of extremes in attachment, and there are normal extremes in that in different age stages of development. But attachment is something that we really see as an issue with children in crisis. Self-regulation, we've talked about developing and maintaining the ability to notice and control feelings such as frustration, anger, and fear. We see, and this is where certainly in some ways resiliency is modeled. And we talked about this with trauma last month. If I look into my mommy's eyes as a small child, even as a teenager, I look into my mom's eyes, she's okay. There's something in me that feels like I'm going to be okay. I look into dad's eyes, he's not scared. He's got this. I'm not scared. We've got this. Children mirror. We all mirror off of each other. We all do this with each other. We all look into each other's eyes to see if we're okay. But children especially do this. And so if a child spends a lot of time with someone who is unable to regulate their emotions, that can actually be learned, where I learn to have extreme out of control emotions. I learn to manipulate the people around me or my circumstances with my emotions. So we see this sometimes in families that have experienced long-term, maybe even generational crisis, is if no one in the family knows how to meaningfully trust in relationship. No one in the family knows how to have a healthy level of attachment, where I spend time with someone and they leave and we're okay. We reunite, we're okay. We are separated again, we're okay. This normal process of in and out of different levels of intimacy. And I'm good at every stage. I don't have to have you right here, but it's not that I'm apathetic about you, right? If they don't see that modeled, because no one in the family knows how to do that, then in that sense, resiliency is very difficult because they've not seen it. They've not seen any element of it modeled. And so we really do, a lot of this is we naturally model, we naturally demonstrate. And if they're in families that are really dysfunctional, they're actually maybe modeled the inability to be resilient, that we don't bounce back. We fall and we stay down, and we fall again and it goes down lower. So some of that you'll see in this as well. And then competency, mastering developmental tasks and developing the ability to plan and organize for the future. So sometimes we call this executive function, but I have the ability I'm developing appropriately, developmentally appropriate pace, and I'm able to problem solve. I'm able to organize for the future. All of those are skills that really feed into resiliency. So let's talk for a few minutes about how we can nurture each of these. How do we nurture attachment? How do we as the helpers nurture attachment? So we want to encourage someone to believe that they're unconditionally loved and respected. And if you engage a young person or a child who has never believed that, and you are the first source of unconditional love and respect in their life, very often they will test this to the extreme. Oh yeah, you're going to love me no matter what I do? Let's see it. And they're going to throw everything imaginable at you to try to prove, no, there is something out there that I can do and you won't love me anymore. And so sometimes this can be really hard, but unconditional love and respect. If I believe that someone unconditionally loves me and respects me, then it's a safe place where I can attach to them appropriately. We will not leave you. Attachment is very much tied in with the sense of abandonment. And many of the children that you serve have been in the foster care system, have been passed from family member to family member. They've been left with strangers. At least to them, it was a stranger. Like was mentioned earlier, the constant moving around. They've been in a variety of different preschools and daycares and schools, and there's no predictability to it. And it feels like I'm just left with strangers all the time. So combating a sense of abandonment, right? We are stable and secure whether or not you are. So the adult, the primary caregiver, the adults in the child's life are modeling to the child, when you are angry, when you're having a tantrum, when you're sad, we're still okay. There's a place of security. There's a place of unchanging stability, regardless of what's going on with your emotions. So to the child, your emotional state does not affect my emotional state. That encourages safe attachment. So when the child is yelling and screaming, I'm not also yelling and screaming. Every time you cry, I cry. That doesn't model health. That doesn't give space for healthy attachment. Again, big topic we're really narrowing down. So as a staff, we are modeling that when the child yells, when the child has done something that's really inconvenient for me, when the child is filthy, when the child has a dirty diaper, when the child has just broken something, whatever, we are okay. My emotional stability is not determined by your emotional stability. Predictability encourages attachment, routines, rituals that are predictable. Here's the big glaring problem with this. When we think about providing direct services and attachment, and that is that if we model all of these things as someone who's engaging homeless children, if I successfully model unconditional love and respect and unconditional acceptance, the child can attach to me. And then, as we mentioned earlier, as Miranda mentioned, the child's leaving. So this becomes really tricky, especially if you have children who attach to you or to other members of your program, and they've never attached to anyone before. It's never worked to trust anyone before. But when they trust you, right, you're always there. You keep your promises, don't you? So here's this adult who's playing games with me and asking me personal questions and making me feel special and making me feel seen and teaching me new skills. Obviously, they wouldn't word out everything this way, but I'm feeling this growth and I'm feeling alive and all the world is feeling wonderful. And so I trust this adult and I attach to this adult who's not going to be a permanent part of my life. I was working in shelter and we had an agency come in and they played games with the kids all morning and provided lunch. It was very cool. And then when they left, they gave each of the children a blanket. It was huge. It's like a twin comforter. And they were very brightly colored. They were like bright pink, bright yellow, stuff like that. And on the blanket, from the top of the blanket to the bottom, was a full-size picture of a guardian angel, is what they called it. So it was a man, it was an enormous man, very muscular. He wasn't wearing a shirt, very muscular, holding a sword, holding a shield with enormous wings behind him. There was one where the angel was white, one where the angel was brown, one where the angel was Asian. And they passed them out and they said, if you will, if you wrap this blanket around you, your guardian angel will protect you and nothing bad will happen to you. Lots of mixed emotions, reactions from staff, lots of mixed reactions from residents. But one family, as they passed out the blankets, was a family with a mom with 7 children, and they just had a very strong reaction. One of them took the blanket and started banging it on the floor. One of them took the blanket and immediately started trying to rip it. The older children just cursed and kind of walked out. And so I went to the mom, I said, everything okay? And she said, yeah. She said, before we came here, we were at a big shelter in Atlanta. And these blankets were distributed in the morning, and they told the kids, if you wrap up in this blanket, your guardian angel will protect you and nothing bad can happen to you. She said, my kids had just come out of foster care. They had been spread out. She had just come out of incarceration. And so when she had come to this shelter, her family was reunited. Many of the children didn't even know each other. Some of them had run away from foster care and been placed in group homes. Some of them had been abused. Some of them had loved their foster family and been pulled out of it. All this, 7 kids with all these reactions. And they'd received these blankets at a mission that they were staying at in Atlanta in the morning. And they had fully embraced it and wrapped up in the blankets. That night, when the night staff came in, they took all the families, as they did every night, up to the bunk room where there was like 400 bunk beds, and all the kids and moms slept up there. And they weren't allowed to bring their own blankets. And all of their personal possessions had to fit into a locker, and the blankets didn't fit in the lockers. So the staff took all the blankets away. So for these children, they had received this blanket and believed, some of them for the first time, that they were safe. They curled up in it all day and believed, I'm safe. And then the very place where they had received the blanket ripped it away, I'm being dramatic, and threw it away. And so in the same day, they received the strong sense of security, attachment, safe, love, all these things that they portrayed into the blanket. And then the very same day, it was all ripped away by the very same people. If we're not careful, we can do that. We can inadvertently do that. So when we think about helping children develop resiliency, we have really got to focus on helping them attach to individuals, institutions that are permanent, so that, and this is hard to do, right? Because I love these kids. I want them to love me. That's normal. But I need to be constantly turning them back to helping them to believe that they are unconditionally loved and respected by mom and dad, by grandma, by their coach. What are those sources of sustainable attachment that I can turn them toward? Because it's not me. Even in permanent supportive housing, if you're a case manager, if you're someone, I'll probably be around for a while. That's really risky. So you want to be, in order to encourage resilience, you've always got to be encouraging attachment with a permanent part of their lives. Even if that permanent part of their lives doesn't do that as well as you do, doesn't pay attention to them the way you do, doesn't show affection to them the way you do, or the way your program does, the way you all as a staff do. You've got to point them towards the source of love and respect and acceptance that they have, that is sustainable. That's what attachment is all about. Because if they get super attached to me, and we've all had this happen, right? I've had families leave shelter and I had to pull that child off my leg. Yes, right? So sometimes that's unavoidable, but as much as possible, pushing them towards finding these things in those who will always be with them, and learning to receive that in the way that the adults around you give it, even if it's not ideal. Okay. Oh, when mom says this, what she's saying is she loves you so much, right? Maybe mom never says, I love you so much, but mom does always buy you ice cream on Fridays, right? Or mom always always tucks you in at night. When mommy tucks you in at night, what she's saying is she loves you so much. How do I help them to see the love and acceptance and affirmation that they're getting from the adults who will be with them? Again, this is hard because you're working with children who may not have any adults who will always be with them, maybe in and out of foster care. They may go from family member to family member. So how can I help them to look for, to find sources of love and respect and affirmation and acceptance around them from different sources even? Those are the kinds of skills we're helping to build. How do we help? We can promote self-regulation so that children don't feel like I am totally a slave to my emotions. So I'm only okay if I'm emotionally okay. This is that idea, if you saw the movie Inside Out, the idea that I've got this control panel and my emotions are pushing the buttons. And when sad's in control, I feel sad, and sad overwhelms me and I act out of sadness and I'm controlled by sadness. Hopefully that's not real life. Hopefully we're not controlled by our emotions. Hopefully we don't perceive all of reality based on our emotions. Children struggle with that. Adults who have struggle with executive functioning skills or struggle with social skills or emotional skills can also struggle with that. But our emotions don't represent reality. So how can I feel something strongly? Anger, sadness, happiness, excitement, whatever it is. Identify this is what I'm feeling, and I accept it and I manage it. It doesn't control me. It doesn't overwhelm me. I don't repress it. I can't feel that, right? This is what I'm feeling. What am I feeling right now? Why do I feel that way? Okay, what am I going to do with it? Right? Huge towards building resiliency. I'm not overwhelmed by my emotional responses. So we can do all kinds of things that allow children to develop self-regulation skills, teaching them just to identify their emotions. What are we feeling right now? I would do this with kids in shelter sometimes multiple times a day. Frank, what are you feeling right now? Why do you think you're feeling that way? If it was a safe environment. So lots of activities around that. A staff who can model self-regulation. Sometimes we need to think about de-escalation training and conflict resolution training, but a staff who models self-regulation and who can also handle and accept intense emotions and anxiety. We talked about that. I can see a child who's completely out of control emotionally, and I'm okay. I'm still all right. I'm not showing them they're all right. Creating a safe space for intense emotions. Sometimes in a shelter setting, if even a small child just won't stop crying, the whole place is going to fall apart, right? We've got to get this baby to stop crying. We've got to get this kid to stop yelling. And so we can do a lot of maladaptive behaviors around basically sit down and shut up, and do whatever it takes to make them sit down and shut up because no one can handle this anymore. How can we create a place, create an atmosphere? How do we mitigate really strong emotions from children? Not a threat at this point. It's just a child who's really angry or really sad or really frustrated or really excited. How do we create a safe space for that? How do we create opportunities for self-expression? In this idea of resilience, children who are very involved in sports, children who do something really well, whether it's play chess or play soccer, dance, make music, art, maybe it's math, whatever it is, something that, man, this is my thing and I do this really well. So something that I can master, something that helps me to express myself, something that makes me feel special. All of these, how do we create an environment where that's allowed? Can we hang up people's artwork? Can we have a time where we do karaoke? Can we have a time where people are allowed to dance around? What can we do so that children are allowed to express themselves, and individuality and creativity are encouraged and praised and recognized? I have the power to make an impact on the world. What I am and who I am is seen and loved, and right? We want to look for opportunities for that. How do we encourage social and emotional competency? We create opportunities for positive peer interactions. Oh, that can be very hard in shelter. That may be something, again, how do we point towards the sustainable sources of that at school, in sporting events? Again, it can be really hard with children who are homeless. But how do we look for those positive peer interactions? How do we develop problem-solving skills, giving children opportunities to solve problems, even things like board games and puzzles, constantly asking questions. We were going to have tuna fish sandwiches for lunch today, but there's not enough tuna fish. What do you think we should do? Turning the problem to the child, giving them an ability to express power, to make choices, to express preference. All of that encourages problem-solving skills. Providing opportunities to demonstrate power and control. What would you like to do? And then we actually do that. Showing mom and dad how to encourage this. It's really hard for a family in crisis to have the energy to give their children lots of choices. Sometimes we don't have the energy for, right? Even we're not in crisis. Encouraging mom and dads, what can you do to help your child see that they have power, they have control, they make choices? Practice assertiveness and decision-making skills. Okay, we talked about that. There is a difference. There can be value in a child feeling rescued, feeling like, someone came in and found me and rescued me. There can be some value in that, especially with attachment. In general, though, there's a big difference between I made good decisions and I was rescued. And so sometimes children will really like this idea of, I need someone to rescue me. I need someone to take care of me. And that's all natural. But if we can encourage children to develop skills around wherever I am, whoever is available to me, whatever support system I have some power. I have the power to see the best in the situation. I have the power to make choices that will keep me safe. Boy, this can be compromised for children in a lot of situations, but in general, you always have some power to make a decision about how you think about it, about what you do with your fear, what you do with your anger. So teaching children, instead of leaning towards a who's going to rescue me mindset, who's going to save me, what am I going to do in this situation? What am I going to do? I have this much room to make decisions, but what am I going to do with it? Especially as they get older, especially when we think about middle schoolers and high schoolers and young adults that we work with. Yes, again, fighting victim mentality. Yes, this situation is hard. This situation is, what are you going to do? What can you do? What choice can you make? And engaging with children around the really difficult situations. Yep, that's what's happening. Sometimes we don't want to do that. Sometimes we want to make children feel like everything's great. We want to ignore the difficult situations, or we want to create this environment in shelter or in case management or in whatever that everything's fine, everything's good, everything's happy, right? Let's try to keep everybody happy. Let's just try to constantly be. A lot of what we can do is say, yes, let's look at the terrible situation you're in. Let's look at the difficult situation you're in. That's what it is. Mom said caseworker, DCS's caseworker is coming this afternoon, and you're going with them, right? What are we going to do? What choices can you make? What can you do with that information? And walking through that and talking through that is a big part, as opposed to, I hope they're good. I hope they take care of me. I hope they're nice to me. I hope I hope the adult saves the day. What can you do? What power do you have? Typically, even in the hardest situations, we still have the power to make decisions towards health, towards coping. So encouraging that, looking for that can be huge, as opposed to, I hope it's this, I wish it was this, again, moving away from victim mentality, moving towards power and control, even if it's this much. Supporting the family and not just the child, a strengths-based approach. That's what we're talking about. And given the family as it is, what can the child do to feel powerful and control? What can the family do to support them? We know that a child's emotional stability is very closely tied into the emotional stability of their primary caregivers. The number one indicator, research indicates, I didn't actually quote the study here, I usually do, but the number one indicator of a child's emotional stability is the emotional stability of their primary caregiver. So when I think about helping a child develop resiliency, I need to spend a lot of time focused on the family, the primary caregivers. Because if that primary caregiver is emotionally solid, emotionally sound, that's going to largely influence the ability of the child to cope. So how can we strengthen the whole family? Thinking out again too about what resources are available to this family. Is there a Big Brothers Big Sisters program? Do they have a mentoring program? Do they have a really good Sunday school? Do they have a really good community support group? What do they have available to them? It may not be ideal, but let's see what they have. How can they find connection there? How can they build relationship there? How can they find affirmation there? What support can they get in what they have available to them? Let's really make the most of that and think about that strengths-based approach. Safety planning. I do a whole nother training on safety planning. I think we'll do one in this series, maybe after the first of the year, but safety planning with children is huge. It's so important, but safety planning can make a child feel powerful. Okay, so again, we're looking at the situation as it is. That's what safety planning is. You look at the situation as it is. When mom and dad are fighting, what can you do? Where could you go? Let's think about the house, okay? I know this child's going back into a domestic violence situation. I know this child's going to be in a situation where there's violence. So what should they do? What can they do? Help them think through that. can give that. Now, some children won't, some children can't. They'll shut down, they won't talk about it. That's fine. Obviously not going to push that. But if a child has the ability to think through, yeah, they do fight. What can I do? That's another thing I would do with the Playmobil people. Mommy and Daddy are fighting. Where should Susie go? Where would be a safe place for Susie? What could Susie do so that she doesn't feel sad while they're fighting? It's so scary when they're fighting. What should Susie do? Could she color? You know, all the different options. Where could she go in the house? Does she hide under the bed? Then she hides under the bed. Great. She made a decision. She has power. She can hide under the bed. She's got a plan, right? That's all wonderful. That all builds resilience. Okay. So thinking through those different elements of that child's experience. Susie's going to go to foster care. How is she feeling about that? What could she do to make it, you know, whatever the situation is? When I feel this way, I can this way. Whatever those emotions are that the child's having a hard time regulating. This makes me feel overwhelmed. When I feel that way, I can. That's part of a good safety plan. Who are the safe people in your life? What are the safe places? Okay. All of that, thinking through all of that with the child can help them to feel personal agency, can help them to feel powerful. Laughing as you do that, developing that sense of humor and not taking things too seriously, even though it's a serious situation. Don't make promises you can't keep. That's what I hated about the blanket, right? Don't say something like, if she goes here, she'll never get hurt. If she hides under the bed, nothing can happen to her. It's not true. Don't say it. And an ability to build resiliency and to make the child feel safer and stronger and more courageous. Don't make promises that aren't true. Then when that doesn't work out, it takes back resiliency. I've had children describe terrible things that happened to them. And to be able to sit and say, what could you think about when that's happening to make you feel safe and strong, right? What can the child actually control and do, right? So we'll just keep moving because we haven't been a very chatty group today. Does anyone have anything else that we think of that we would include in a safety plan for a child that would encourage resiliency and feeling powerful and feeling any control? Any other ideas around that? All right, we will keep moving and we will get through a little bit early. Everyday messages, things that I can say to a child, just part of our everyday encounters, that every time I'm engaging children as a staff, we're all saying this all the time in 100 different ways, right? What are the main messages that we just want to keep reiterating to encourage resiliency? This is not your fault. Every time I hear a child say something that would seem to indicate that, nope, that's not true. This is not your fault. Being in shelter, being in crisis, being poor, having to switch schools, mommy and daddy fighting, daddy in prison, mommy in treatment, not your fault, not your fault. They said it was my fault. They're wrong. It's not your fault. Those words need to be coming out of your mouth all the time. And you need to be demonstrating that all the time. This is not your fault. You did not break this. You cannot fix it. This did not happen because of you, and you are not the solution. We say that saying that all the time, right? Nope, you didn't break it. You can't fix it. I'm really glad you got a straight A. Woohoo! But that's not, it's not your job to make mommy happy, is it? It's not your job to keep mommy from drinking, is it? Whatever it is, whatever the situation it is, you didn't break it. You can't fix it. You are who you are, and they are who they are. And this is for mom and dad to work out. That's really for mommy to figure out. That's really for daddy to figure out. And so to keep re-emphasizing, this is not your fault. Fighting shame, fighting guilt. You are loved, you are valuable. There can be a real temptation to say, I love you to a child. Again, what we want to make sure the child knows, we don't want the child to leave shelter and the only person who's ever said, I love you is gone. So if I say, you are loved, you are valuable, hopefully I'm giving a message that goes with that child anywhere they go. You are loved, you are valuable, you are special, you are beautiful, all those things, as opposed to that being rooted in me. And so when you're not with me anymore, the one person who believed it is gone. But I'm sharing a truth that goes with you where you go. So signs, things they can take with them, things they can see, things they can hang up and remind themselves that you are loved, you are valuable. And it's not just me, it's the whole universe that believes this, right? This is where spirituality too can be helpful with that. You will be awesome. This is not all of life. Tell children this all the time. All of life is not going to be like this. It's not going to be like this forever. You're not going to be 12 forever. You're not going to be in a homeless shelter forever. You're not going to be living with mom and dad forever. If that's helpful, that can, if that doesn't, if that's not a scary thing, it's not going to be like this forever. This is temporary. Again, I'm giving inspiring, I'm picturing a promising future. There's a big wide world out there and you're going to be a big part of it. It's not going to be like this. You're not going to be in this shelter feeling out of control forever. You are okay. I don't know what's going to happen with whatever the circumstances are. I don't know what's going to happen with your house. I don't know what's going to happen with your dog. I don't know what, fill in the blank. But you will be okay. Now, a lot of this comes down to how you define okay. If you define okay as you're not okay unless you have a good house, unless you have a warm bed, unless you have 3 meals a day, whatever, then you can't honestly say that. I define okay as who you are as a person. Who you are is intact and it's real, and you can face horrible things and not be damaged by it. You, who you are, can be okay no matter what happens to you. I believe even if you die, right? Who you are okay. You can come through anything and still be intact. So you will be okay. That's how I define okay. So if I define okay that way, then I can look at a child, I can look at anyone and honestly say, I believe it, you will be okay. So all of these are things that you can just keep pushing, keep reminding, keep as everyday messages. Last thing, as we think of for us as helpers, things to remind ourselves of. As we think about this very, very heavy topic that we've talked about today, as we think about children and trauma and the bad things that happen to them and what helps them recover and what doesn't, why they're overwhelmed sometimes and why they're not. Very important to remember, we are not the solution. We're not the solution. Again, there's nothing I can do that guarantees a certain outcome. We're providing tools, we're providing hope, we're providing inspiration, we're encouraging, we're cheering them on. That's what I can do. That's what's mine to do. That's what's mine to do. We are not the sustainable options. So real temptation to be the savior, to be the Messiah, to be the mommy, to be the daddy. We're not. So we've got to maintain boundaries there, even as we think about encouraging resiliency. Resiliency is always possible. We hear this, right? We read books about people who have just had terrible things happen to them, and now they're, fill in the blank. Now they're this champion, this hero. We have to believe that to keep doing this work. Important to remember that some children will seem like they're not being affected at all, and they may be, and some children may seem like they're in a hopeless situation, they're completely overcome, and they may be okay. So we have to keep using the same trauma-informed principles, the same principles and tools of resiliency, regardless of how the child appears to be doing. And then love and goodness have power. I believe that. I believe that what the investment that we're making, that there is power in that. And so there are children who have hope today because you go to work. There are children who are trying in school today, who are trying despite, oh my goodness, all the circumstances, because they saw something in the way you looked at them. They'll never say that. They can't explain it. Don't we all feel that way? Can't you list off the adults who just believed in you, right? There are children who have hope and power and who are going today, who are striving today. There are babies who are smiling today because of you. And so we have to remind ourselves of that. We can't measure it. We don't hear it very often, but it's true. And so we have to believe that in order to keep going, that the work that you're doing has power. All right, so these are some of the resources. This will be available if you'd like it. There are tons of resources. If you Google resiliency and homeless children, you'll see all kinds of toolkits and things like that. And what I've said here today aligns with, I think you'll see, I've picked the most consistent elements of that, the most common denominators, but you'll see other factors in this as well. Any comments, questions before we go today?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Is there like a certain age range in which resiliency is easier to work on and to be, I don't know if the word's completed, but in order to reach resiliency easier?
That is an excellent question, and it's a little disputed. As we think about attachment as a key component of resiliency, attachment, some of these principles like attachment and self-regulation, ideally children are learning before they're 3 years old, definitely before they're 5. These ideas that when I scream and cry, mommy's still okay, you know, that my ability to both impact the world and that the world is safe no matter what I'm feeling. A lot of that ideally we have nailed down in our little hearts by the time we're 3 years old. That's tricky because that's not something in a shelter, you're not going to have 24/7 exposure to an infant. And it's difficult to do those activities and reinforce that in an infant. So when we think about our, you know, practically speaking, our ability to influence that, that becomes a little bit easier as the child ages, because we're doing that primarily through activities and through conversation. And so if a child's not able to, certainly we can demonstrate it in a very young child, and it needs to be nailed down to a very young child. But as those who are not the primary caretakers, we are primarily doing that in ways that are best received by children after the age of 5. It does become harder as the child goes through puberty and passes puberty. In some ways, it is easier to have some of these conversations and have some of these higher level thinking skills and problem solving skills in middle schoolers and in teenagers, but also the ability, especially during puberty, the ability to think rationally, all of the things that we've talked about, attachment, self-regulation, cognitive issue, all of that, connectedness, all that's harder through puberty. And so that's probably one of the hardest ages. So there's what science tells us about attachment, and then there's what we can practically do. So different activities will be more or less appropriate at different ages. When we think about the safety planning elements of that, that's certainly easier with an older child. The attachment can be easier with a younger child. It's very difficult. You can help an older child to identify ways in which they're not attaching, but boy, that's hard. It's hard to address attachment issues in a teenager. You got to be really creative there. So
now, and is resilience itself, is it something that can be like encouraged at the schools or with like teachers that they work with on a day-to-day basis?
absolutely, because if they can connect, if they feel connected to someone, that encourages resilience. And so if you feel like that there are teachers or coaches or dance teachers, someone like that, that's going to be a regular part of the child's life, then certainly moving them towards connection in that direction can be really helpful. School, often, there are a lot of children who have traumatic childhoods, who identify school as the strongest source of consistency, predictability, connection, attachment in their lives. So the school provided what the family did not. There are a lot of children who experience that. Now, some don't, but certainly the school can be that. Very often we see with homelessness, homeless families are often slow to identify to the school system. So how does that connection take place? If you have, an ROI in place or something that allows you to connect with the school, to bridge that can be huge. Extended family members, same way, if you have any ability to serve that role. But yeah, sometimes the school academic success can help a child to feel a lot of the things that we said would be part of personal strengths, powerless, be feeling powerful, feeling in control. When I study, I make an A, everyone loves it. There's weakness in that can become unhealthy, but it can also be a way of encouraging resiliency. I have power, I'm good at something. So yeah, absolutely, the school can be a big source of that.
Thank you.
Anything else before we go? Thank you so much for attending today. We will have another session next month. This will be recorded and we can get that to you as well. Feel free to reach out. Specifically, we are here to help children. This grant allows us to help children with teen care. If you have any children or families with health issues, whether they qualify for teen care or not, we're happy to help with that. If there are questions and things as we as you think about this, as you process it, if you want to think about ways to process this as a team or as a staff, feel free to reach out and we're happy to talk more about this. Thank you so much, guys. Have a wonderful rest of the week, and maybe we will see you next month.